for those of you tuning in, um, Evyatar has had a fascinating life history. I'm not going to speak about it. However, he is the author of a wonderful memoir called The Days and the Seasons. If you wish to learn more about our speaker, please consult that book. Um, he has lived in Israel for many, many years. He served as a faculty member at Ben Gurion University in Beersheba for a short time, but his major academic career was spent as a faculty member at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where he did his own studies. His special field is modern Jewish history. He's written extensively on various aspects of that, including a published book called The Balfour Declaration in Historical Perspective. He also, excuse me, is the author of a book called The Zionist Movement in the United States. He put out an atlas of modern Jewish history and a good deal more. For a period of 9 or close to 10 years, Evyatar Friesel served as the state archivist of Israel, a very important position which gave him responsibility for overseeing the country's archives. And as one very significant deposit in that archives, he opened the papers of Adolf Eichmann. I needn't tell any of you about the significance of that. My own discovery of his recent writings has come with looking at some important essays that he's published with the Begin Sadat Center. One is called the Jerusalem Declaration and its Jewish supporters. He's going to expand on that as part of his talk with us today. Evyatar, I hate to say it, but when the history of Jew hatred in our time comes to be written, Jewish collusion in it is going to have to figure in heavily. Not many people want to look at it for a bunch of different reasons, but you have stepped forward and have been opening our eyes to that phenomenon, certainly an important one. I know it will be part of the material you'll cover in your talk to us today. It's now my honor to hand over to you. We're eager to hear what you have to say.
Hello, I hope you hear me clearly. Thank you very much for that introduction. I shall speak first about the new expression of anti-Semitism, and then about certain internal tensions that are developing in present Jewry in connection with that issue and regarding anti-Semitism in general. To note, as the very term anti-Semitism is not exact when employed in a contemporary context. Anti-Semitism actually refers to a mutation of classic Jew hatred based on race theories that were current from the late 19th to the mid-20th centuries and now have lost their significance. Jew hatred or Judophobia are the right terms for the present phenomenon. Nevertheless, the term anti-Semitism has by now acquired a generalized meaning, and that will be used also in this presentation. A trend has recently emerged that combines Jew hatred with other cultural positions, such as anti-racism, anti-Islamism, xenophobia, and so on. We hear anti-Semitism and anti-Islamism express similar hating attitudes, or we oppose anti-Semitism and hatred against foreigners. Such connections are mostly misplaced. Regarding xenophobia, hatred of foreigners, representative modern Jews were not foreigners. Louis de Brandeis, Albert Einstein, Sigmund Freud, and many, many more were well-integrated citizens in their respective countries. Nor has anti-Semitism to do with anti-Islamism. The coupling results from a superficial mix of the psychological and the social meaning of the emotion hate. Neither in their historical roots, nor in their cultural content, or in their present significance, have Judophobia and anti-Islamism anything in common. And with regard to racism and Jew hatred, a combination which is frequently mentioned, in Nazi anti-Semitism, it was a major factor, but now it has only limited significance. In spite of all this, anti-Semitism in present public discourse is rarely mentioned on its own. It has become politically correct to bind Jew hatred to some other cultural or political issue in public life, mostly a negative one. However, the moment the conjunction "and" appears, I mean anti-Semitism and, the anti-Semitism factor is pushed into a corner. The result that should be called Antisemitism-light is not exactly an elaborated position, but more of an attitude. And nevertheless, an attitude that is influential and broadly shared and brings about a softer, a domesticated version of Jew hatred. Furthermore, anti-Semitism is frequently described as a right-wing ideological phenomenon. This tempered with the occasional shock proclamation that anti-Semitism has reached the middle of society. In fact, Jew hatred never emerged from some ideological corner and suddenly arrived in mid-society. Judophobia was always established in the social middle, and from there, depending on the circumstances, move it in this or that direction. In our days, an Israel pattern of Jew hatred has emerged again from the middle of society and supported by many liberals and leftists. Usually people that preach tolerance and understanding for all, with the exception of the Jewish state. Such people participate in the BDS movement, which is evolving sheep's clothing, a political undertaking whose aim is the abolishment of Israel. This, of course, in the name of democratic and humanistic values. Now, how to explain that broad ideological disarray that blurs the understanding of Jew hatred and harms the efforts against it? A major reason seems the peculiar way the historical dimension of Judophobia is considered in present public perceptions. The historical approach, well expressed by scholars such as Polyakov, Katz, Bauer, Wistrich, Schwarz-Friesel, Nirenberg, and many others, explains anti-Semitism as a cultural component deeply rooted in Western culture and emphasizes that it is a factor by itself, with a millennium history behind it. The historical approach stresses the chameleon-like character of Jew hatred, how it has changing expressions and maxims along the centuries and adopted to shifting cultural trends and also social conditions. All this while remaining the basic same negative attitude toward Jews and Judaism. For centuries, so the historical view, the basic Judophobic arguments were religious, In modern times, they became mostly secular. From the late 19th to mid-20th centuries, the racial approach already mentioned was dominant. Now it receded. A further transformation according to historical approach is happening from the late 20th century onwards to our days, the Israelization of anti-Semitism. The Jewish state, the most vibrant expression of present-day Jewish life, has become a major goal of a new generation of anti-Semites. Today, Israel is a new Jew. It is not that the historical approach regarding anti-Semitism were rejected in present academic and public understanding. What happens is that frequently a doubtful interpretative pattern imposes itself. A basic tenet of the historical position is simply ignored, namely the uniqueness of Jew hatred. Public figures, but also scholars, are unwilling to regard Judaism and Judophobia as a phenomenon that exists and persists on its own in Western cultural awareness, as a phenomenon occasionally linked but basically unrelated to racism or xenophobia or to any other ideological position. A muted resistance has established itself against the recognition of Judophobia not simply as a prejudice, but as doctrine deeply embedded in the Western so-called culture. Originally, it was formulated in terms religious. Now it's mostly secular. This while all along the aim of Jew hatred remains unchanged. What aim? To quote a statement of Jean-Paul Sartre from the 1950s, what the anti-Semite wishes, what he prepares, is the death of the Jew. The question is, why this ambiguity in contemporary public opinion regarding anti-Semitism? There seems to be a split in contemporary Western awareness between the objective and the subjective comprehension of Jew hatred. Undoubtedly, Jew hatred is a phenomenon society has come to recognize, but only up to a point. The horrors of the Holocaust forced people toward a reckoning, but we sleep here in the complex realm of the subjective factors influencing public demeanor, which is a situation that demands caution. A full recognition of Jew hatred as an independent factor with deep cultural roots, that means ultimately something that is present objectively or not consciously or unconsciously in the cognitive and emotional awareness of each individual. Such an awareness demands a measure of self-insight that is clearly difficult on a personal level and perhaps impossible on the broader social sphere. Obviously, centuries of Jew hatred cannot be overcome by some decades of reflection and soul searching, as far as this really has happened. As it is, people, amongst them also learned academicians, lean towards a not so demanding version of anti-Semitism, one that is comparable and compatible to existing social and cultural categories, such as racism, xenophobia, anti-modernity, anti-Islamism, and so on. That softer design of Jew hatred, that is anti-Semitism-light. Antisemitism-light generates material for long articles, loud statements, large conferences, and well-endowed research programs. The deplorable result is that antisemitism-light pushes aside the real Jew hatred, which is very much alive and dangerous as ever. An example. Recently, a German professor, a self-declared humanist, wrote to the Israel embassy in Berlin, I quote, "Israel is our normality and should be dissolved peacefully for the sake of us all," unquote. The frightening side of Judophobia is evil vitality, is adaptability to modern conditions and circumstances. The beast which is threatening intentions lurking in the shadows of the so-called Western culture, that face it gets concealed by the anti-Semitic light stance under layers of cultural correct platitudes. Now, how do Jews react to that new situation? A disturbing fact that a number of Jewish intellectuals, among them historians and political scientists, adopt and divulge the anti-Semitism-light position. We are confronted here with an encounter of two unrelated intellectual developments, one among non-Jews, the other in Jewish society. An example of a meeting between these different tendencies and different interests was a recently so-called Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. The declaration was presented as an alternative to the well-established and internationally recognized ERA definition of anti-Semitism. ERA is the abbreviation of International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and it was now stated that ERA, I quote, is neither clear nor coherent and blurs the difference between anti-Semitic speech and legitimate criticism of Israel and Zionism, unquote. This matter of criticism of Israel, repeatedly stressed in certain circles, is suspicious. Fact is that Israel and or its policies are criticized everywhere, every day, including in Israel itself. Fact is that Israel and or its policies are one thing, and Israel-related Jew hatred is something else. And each is easy to distinguish one from the other. Obviously, there were other reasons and urges that drove the initiators of the Jerusalem Declaration. The declaration dealt with two issues only indirectly related: anti-Semitism and the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Regarding anti-Semitism, part of what the declaration states is either similar to the ERA formulation or is implicit there. However, the declaration does not accept the above-mentioned central tenet of the history-based research on anti-Semitism, namely that Jew hatred is a doctrine by itself. The declaration states the opposite. In the name of liberal principles, the fight against anti-Semitism is, I quote, inseparable from the overall fight against all forms of racial, ethnic, cultural, religious, and gender discrimination. Jew hatred, so defined, tumbles in the domesticated version. It is no longer the frightening beast with the inner fire capable of decimating millions of Jews. It's only a prejudice like others, that a society supposedly liberal knows how to recognize and how to cope with. Again, an example of anti-Semitism-light. The impelling objective of the declaration, whether its authors were aware of it or not, was not Jew hatred. It was Israel, the Jewish state. And from the start, the approach was a biased one. An indispensable condition of any consideration about a conflict between two human groups, in this case Palestinians and Israelis, is that the claims and actions of both sides should be pondered. In the declaration, one hears only what the Israelis are supposed to do or not to do. About the intentions of the Arabs, which are frequently genocidal, not a word. Implicitly, Israel is the aggressor, the Palestinians are the victims. Implicitly, the supporters of the declaration, also the Jews among them, adopted the Arab-Palestinian narrative, that there is also a Jewish narrative about the presence of the Jews in Israel and about the conflict with the Palestinians, a narrative that is at least as emphatic and powerful as the Arab one. This is completely ignored. The biased approach of the declaration is clearly expressed in its guideline 14 that states, I quote, boycott, divestment, and sanctions are commonplace, non-violent forms of political protest against states. In the Israeli case, they are not, in and of themselves, anti-Semitic, unquote. This is a distortion of reality. The point here are not theoretical concepts, but the BDS organization, whose founding charter of July 2005 listed among its aims, I quote, ending the occupation and colonization of all Arab lands, and 3, respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194, unquote. Leaving open whether the stated intentions are anti-Semitic, or if the goal is only to dismantle the Jewish state, the question that arises is, are the initiators and supporters of the declaration, with their impressive titles and positions, are they really unaware about what is behind the document they support? In fact, the claim of the authors of the declaration, non-Jews as Jews, that their intention was to clarify what anti-Semitism actually means, should bring us to reflect about how devious the disguises are that in our days convey Jew hatred. To note, in addition, statements in the same spirit of the declaration, with the same arguments, with the same signatures, returns in last years every couple of months. All of which brings us to the rather uneasy feeling that the Jewish perspective of these issues should be more carefully considered. The matter had additional import when we consider the fact that many of the about 200 signatures of the declaration were Jews, among them also Israelis, part of them living in Israel, part not. They represented a significant presence, ideological and organizational, in the elaboration of the document. Their involvement had little to do with the fight against anti-Semitism. Their participation expresses something quite different, an ideological confrontation raging in contemporary Jewry about the characteristics of the Jewish state and the place of Israel in present Jewish life. What drives these Jewish critics of Israel? The leading figures among them are academicians, people who in the regular walks of life are balanced in their views and relatively restrained in their public behavior, up to the point when the issue is Israel. Then they turn strident and apocalyptic. The fate of Israel, how Zionism pursues its downfall, proclaims the title of a book by Moshe Zuckerman, published in 2014. Such a doomsday view about the future of Israel, shared by many similar-minded Jewish critics, deserves attention since it mirrors well the state of mind in those Jewish circles. Such Jews frequently support a political and moral picture of Israel-Palestine that is promulgated by a new generation of Israel haters and that is downright surrealistic. A political landscape of the region is present that is static and drafted in black and white, where everybody stands still. No one does or says or plans anything or is responsible for anything. Not the Arabs, not the Palestinians, not the Iranians, nobody. The only active and responsible bearing factor are the Israelis. And they, of course, act wrong, always and since ever. To see the Jewish state as a huge success, born under almost impossible circumstances, that step by step worked itself up to the status of a first world country, a democracy with a developed economy, a functioning multicultural society, and a vibrant life. This seems unacceptable to those Jews, including, strangely enough, the Israelis among them. Which only sharpens the question what social and ideological pressures lay behind the anti-Israel views of a whole section of contemporary Jewish intelligentsia. The historical analysis offers an explanation. This is a conundrum that reflects the major trends that are shaping Jewry in modern times, indeed up to our days, namely the social and cultural integration of the Jews in the Western world. One must keep in mind the complexity involved in that modern development. The integration of the Jews into Western societies was a difficult process, unfolding not in calm laboratory circumstances, but in stormy real-life conditions. Jewish migrations, changes in social condition and cultural circumstances, and the continuing pressure of anti-Semitism. The dynamics of Jewish modernization differed from place to place and from social layer to another. Jewish society divided in a variety of positions influenced by social and spiritual dynamics that were hardly understood. This even when apparently mindful interpretations were formulated and offered. Each of these new Jewish ways expressed its own understanding about what it meant to be a Jew, how they defined the Jew as a group, and consequently how to consider the present and the future of Jewry. The Jews may belong to an old people, but a situation arose in our times where Jewish society became very young and quite unsettled, everywhere in different ways. Inevitably, sharp internal confrontations developed in modern or modernizing Jewry, where opposing concepts of Jewish religiosity, of Jewish secularism, or between Jewish nationalism and Jewish cosmopolitanism came up and clashed. A new Jewish type emerged, fitting a profile described by Isaac Deutscher in the 1960s, the so-called non-Jewish Jew. Meant was a person cosmopolitan, secular, anti-nationalistic, bound to integration in the diverse non-Jewish environments and their spiritual currents. Similar Jewish profiles, driven by the same implicit dynamics, continue to exist also in our days. Wavering between their Gentile attachments and their Jewish roots, many of these Jews tend towards the non-Jewish side and its ideological propensities. However, we should note, in spite of the existential tempests that characterize Jewish modernization, a general tendency existed that was and has remained quite stable. Most modernizing Jews sought integration in those middle-class sectors of Western society bound to liberal and center-left values. In fact, that direction represented the cultural and political anchor of modern Jewry, for which Jews did not see, and with good reason, real alternatives. However, in the last decades, a major breakdown happened in that dominant ideological direction in modern Jewish life. The anti-Israel attitudes that emerged in the center-left and left camp, attitudes that in many cases come close to anti-Semitic views, have upset the conceptual foundations of Jewish modernization and have created a perplexing situation for modern Jewry. One possible Jewish answer to such a baffling development was to recognize the new reality as it is and to try to live with it. Admittedly, in that case, one is left in an ideological no-land, could cut off from the spiritual companions of the past and push towards circles, mostly right-wing ones, with whom Jews have little in common. Another alternative, a disturbing one, is to go along knowingly or unknowingly with a negative attitude towards Israel that now prevails in sectors of center-left and left-oriented society, which is what is happening, unfortunately, to many Jewish academicians. The strains imbued in such a situation are usually kept low-key. However, there is a sector among such Jews where a dormant Israel-critical inclination, mostly due to the influence of left-wing circles, expressed itself in an anti-Israel platform. Surprisingly or not, amongst those Jews are also Israelis. Also living in Israel, they are also bound to the mentioned trends in Western society. These Jews convey the widening rift in present-day Jewry between supporters and critics of the Jewish state, its foundations and its characteristics. In the last dozen of years, many books, articles, statements critical of Israel and of Zionism are published, written by Jews, among them also Israelis. Their participation in the mentioned Jerusalem Declaration on anti-Semitism expresses and continues what by now is an established pattern, a persistent attack against Israel that under different labels returns every couple of months. That confrontation between the different sectors of contemporary Jewry has a rather bizarre aspects. The drive comes from the Jewish critics of Israel, and their tone is highly emotional. However, in Israel itself, such views hardly find an echo. The reaction of the broad Israeli public opinion is to ignore them. Indeed, is to take the whole present anti-Semitic upsurge in stride. The standard Israeli answer to anti-Semitism is, you have a problem with the diaspora? Come to Israel. That is what they have a Jewish state for. Which is an extremely unwise attitude, to say the least. Too many in Israel underrate the fervor of the Jewish anti-Israelism as well as its international connections. How does it happen in Israel? Are Israelis ideologically inert? On the contrary, there hardly is another country with a population so ideologically active. Nevertheless, Israeli society has its particular tendencies and is creating its own cultural and ideological setups. A large part of the Israeli population tends to an ideological and cultural direction that is different from the one upheld by the academicians mentioned above. Israeli public opinion is moving ideologically to the right and is Israel-centered, while the Jewish critics of Israel belong to the center and center-left camp and are mostly cosmopolitan-minded. Regarding the drift rightwards in Israeli public life, one may like or dislike the trends. I personally belong to the dislikers. But the tendency happens in a political environment that is open and democratic. The reasons of that rightward tendency are neither social nor economic, but political. Israelis are affected by the unsolved and seemingly unsolvable Israel-Palestinian conflict, by disappointments regarding Palestinians and Arabs, by the Israeli efforts to find a solution for the confrontation that were rejected, by the threats from the Arab side, by the terror attacks. Obviously, a large sector of the Israeli population has its own understanding about the political realities of the country. It is an open question if their views are not more realistic than those of the Jews in the anti-Israel camp. The positions of the political right in Israel are supported by the large Jewish religious sector. Differently from other developed countries, Israel has a growing religious observant population, the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox. The mentioned groups are ideological dynamic, again a factor to be recognized whether one likes it or not. About 4 parties in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, are declaredly or implicitly religious, meaning religious Orthodox. On the other side, the center-left and left sectors in Israel are ideologically asleep. The Israeli Labor Party, the political forces that was behind the creation of the Jewish state, is now a feeble shadow of his former self and barely manages to enter the Knesset. The small religious reform movement in Israel, whose supporters are mostly center or center-left oriented, has so far not shown the will to uphold their views by means political or other. Whatever that ideological constellation that not by itself explains the underlying bitterness of the Jewish Israel critics or their obsessiveness, their active, shrill, and return time after time with new Israel protests. Many of their proposals are weird. A German Jewish professor described some years ago the call for immigration to Israel as the expression of a collective Jewish death wish. Considering, he wrote, the many dangers the Jewish state is exposed to. A currently much touted idea is that Israelis and Palestinians should form one common state. Originating from the Arab camp, the underlying calculation, which includes, of course, the return of the so-called refugees, is clear, but coming from Jews. Do they not know that it will also intensify the confrontation? Do they not see the self-destruction in neighboring Lebanon, where conflicting groups were supposed to live in a common political framework? The Israeli academicians among the critics of the Jewish state have characteristics of their own. A feeling of helplessness regarding the ideological trends in the country, such as the growing assertiveness of right-wing extremists, are factors embittering those critics and bring them to fall into harmful ideological alignments, such as Antisemitism-light, or damaging political attachment, such as the mentioned Jerusalem Declaration on Antisemitism. Nevertheless, it should be emphasized that these Jewish Israel critics are neither self-hating Jews nor Jewish anti-Semites, even if their utterances are frequently similar to non-Jewish anti-Semitic argumentation. Often they embody a negative Jewish identity, but this is a phenomenon that belongs possibly to the dismay of such Jews to the social framework of modern Jewish life. Many of these Jews blow shrill trumpets, but their message bears no hope, and a vision of continued Jewish life they do not offer. Jewish Israel critics, who are in general people intelligent and not easily deluded, should reflect what they are supporting and with whom they are collaborating. What they cherish as their influence in Western public opinion has a darker side. They are being used in a wide-ranging campaign to harm the Jewish state, the most evident present-day symbol of Jewish vitality. In many cases, such Jews become willing hostages, manipulated in a public environment where anti-Semitic trends, declared or unconscious, continue to exist, to impose themselves, and to threaten Jewish existence. Thank you very much.